Okay, cool. Hey everyone, my name... Oh, are we talking about that?
Sorry.
Brilliant. So, when we started looking at pods, it's been a hell of a journey since back when we had them initial conversations. I mean, we were talking to you about pods, weren't we, for years before we actually brought this product to market.
Yeah.
That's because we just felt like it wasn't working. There wasn't the right thing. I mean, what challenges did we talk about back then?
Well, it was like, yeah, there were loads at that point. There were loads of random pod designs. Because the way the system works is that the coffee actually goes in the back and comes out the front. It's often, when you look at them, it's a little bit upside down, and this back has to be punctured somehow when you pull that lever down in the machine. And some would work by having holes in them already, so there was no puncture required. But because they had to make it shorter, so there was nothing hitting it when you closed it, you could only get like 4.8 grams of coffee in, so you kind of compromised the extraction. They also were then not sealed because they had holes, they were open, so you then had to like individually wrap them or put them in a bag together, which had extra packaging and all the rest of it. Then there were ones which would like break with little triangles with supports on, and I mean you still see those out in the shops, and we found loads of production issues with those where sometimes they wouldn't all break. So and you get a lot of really high failure rate on the extraction where they'd stall out if they didn't all open fully and things like that. Then there were issues with the seals. So we just found that everyone was better for a particular reason, but they all had some kind of endemic drawback. Sustainability was just always a thing for us as well. I know whenever we talked about it, and we looked at ones that were like made entirely out of paper. Again, they weren't oxygen barriered, so they then needed extra packaging. They were also really inefficient to pack. There was a very manual element to them, which added such a price that it meant that they were really kind of exclusive to a very small subset of people who could afford that kind of price per pod. So yeah, it was only once we found these particular European manufacturer of these pods that we kind of felt like we finally got that mix of sustainability, repeatability in terms of their production and quality control, and actual final extraction ability. And so yeah, that they kind of ticked all of the boxes, and then we felt like, okay, finally we can kind of like put some money and weight behind it and actually go for it with the kind of like actually motivated doing it. I mean, we don't. I know you're the same as us, that you don't put anything out there unless you feel like you can, it matches your values and you can stand behind the product. And that was the bit that was always kind of staying our hand up until that point. And then when we finally found these, it was kind of, we could get into the proper production development, and so then open a whole new set of issues.
Yeah. And that's the exciting bit. Like we found the pod, we found the product that solves some of the issues that we were facing around having to outer wrap them because of freshness or having a high failure rate. That's massive. It's one that I think a lot of people might overlook, that we could have the best coffee ever in this pod, but if you stick it in your machine and it fails, you stop buying it because you're not actually experiencing the coffee. All you experience is problems. So having something that's
it's literally a solution to try and remove problems.
Yeah.
So we've literally just always talked about ease of use being this massive differentiator with capsules, and then like you say, you can't be having other different issues associated with it.
Exactly. And then suddenly we've got the product, and then we wanted to make sure that we didn't have the same problems with that other people were having, where the entry to this product became, as a small business, unachievable. And we wanted to have a bit more control. Like we talked in another video, didn't we, about flavour profiling and things like that, which, what barriers do you get when you're trying to explore what coffee tastes good in what way in a pod if you outsource it somewhere else to do all that discovery work? It's a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I remember we just did, as with Lou as well, who's your head of coffee, just loads and loads of iterations and that. But even, I mean, the grinds, there's just like a whole another world of just setting the grind. It's not a question of just using a burr grinder and setting the grind. Like, the type of grind you use, whether you're using a roller grinder, a conical grinder, burr grinders, and the kind of the profile of the size of within a set grind size, where how fine you're grinding your coffee. There's even within that grind that you get, there is going to be a load of really tiny ones as well as some randomly bigger ones. Mainly the bigger tail is obviously on the smaller ones, and you can't have too many of those for extracting on an espresso machine because they'll back up the system and cause lots of other problems. So even just the kind of equipment used to grind your coffee, and that also depends on the coffee you're grinding.
Yeah.
Different altitudes of coffee, different roast levels will all grind in a different way. And so yeah, there were just so many variables, and even though you know the kind of the theory behind it and you try and preempt that with good decisions, ultimately you just got to make a shed load of capsules and a load of different roast profiles and taste them and fail them and mess around. And so yeah, it's a very steep learning curve.
Yeah,
but,
and the failure thing as well, I think, is a good point. Again, just to come back to when we were looking at all the different types of pods on the market, including the ones that we were running off ourselves, it was a case of putting them in the machine back to back, making them, and seeing if each one tasted the same, because that tail on the grind meant that one pod might extract quicker than another pod that suddenly extracts slower, so that every pod that as a customer you would expect to taste the same suddenly doesn't. So we didn't want to put a product out there that every pod you put in your machine is slightly different. We want to get as close to consistency as possible so that you don't have failure rates and you have the same coffee every morning.
Yeah, and it's easier said than done. but you know, there's technology but that's about speccing, you know, check weighs on each of the lines and all this kind of stuff, and it's all solvable. But it was only through doing a massive amount of testing leading up to it that means that you get all that stuff in place rather than trying to do it after the fact. So yeah, it was just these pods coming out and knowing that they were being made in Europe, so the consistency how they were made. Lots of the other ones were around at that time. They, you know, so even compostable ones and that were actually made in Asia, and the production quality in terms of like the thickness even meant it would puncture in a different way and all those kind of things. The fact these are made in Europe and they're made with a carbon neutral company and we get absolute consistency of the product that they're supplying to us even further down the chain is also really important, because then they behave really predictably. Before otherwise, there's just too many different variables. So yeah, quality controls has been a huge thing. So yeah.
So there's problems. There's been barriers to entry. We've been working on it for years. Coffee pods. I feel like there's loads of life in this product. There's loads of innovation that's going to come out of the idea of this product, which really excites us. If you're interested in just staying on that journey with us, then yeah, subscribe and we'll talk more about pods and see where it goes.
Yeah.